So, all right, folks, we're going to talk about freshwater macroinvertebrates today, and we're just going to get started immediately. So what are freshwater macroinvertebrates? Freshwater macroinvertebrates are small organisms that we can see without a microscope. So we have a whole bunch of aquatic insects and other critters that we can see here in this petri dish. And we don't need an actual microscope to be able to see them visually with the naked eye. However, we can still use things like dissecting microscopes and magnifying glasses to see them better and just get an overall better view of these animals. Freshwater macroinvertebrates lack an internal skeletal system. So insects, arachnids, and crustaceans are going to have chitin as their exoskeleton. So when they grow, they need to shed their exoskeleton. And then mollusks such as snails and freshwater mussels have a calcium carbonate exoskeleton. So instead of shedding that, they simply secrete more of a shell as they grow older. Now, freshwater macroinvertebrates live in or partially in water their entire lives. So for example, freshwater mussels are going to be living underwater for the entirety of their lives. But you can have aquatic insects such as mayflies that when they're immature, they're going to be living within the freshwater ecosystem. But as they become mature adults, they take to the sky and move to the terrestrial ecosystem. So why should we care about freshwater macroinvertebrates? Aquatic macroinvertebrates play important roles in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, as well as human recreational activities. So we have an example here of essentially a food pyramid. And right here around the base, we have the freshwater macroinvertebrates. And they play a key role. If you end up taking these guys out of this pyramid, the whole thing is just going to collapse in on itself. So you want to make sure that you keep these guys around. Otherwise, things are going to fall apart. Aquatic macroinvertebrates can help determine water quality in your local streams, rivers, ponds, and lakes. So sometimes we'll go out to stream systems and we'll use what are called data sondes. So they're fancy pieces of equipment that we can stick in the water and we can get chemical readings. So checking like temperature, how much dissolved oxygen is in the water. But the thing is, we can just take a look at the aquatic macroinvertebrates that are living in the streams and get an idea from their communities of how healthy the stream is. So we use biotic indexes of water quality, and we have different groups with different organisms that can tolerate certain amounts of pollution. For example, group 1, these critters need really good water quality, and they are not pollution tolerant. So if you've got pollution in a stream, it's very unlikely that you're going to find these critters here. This is important because all you have to do is sample, look at the bugs, and you can tell, okay, we've got a problem here. We're not seeing like caddisflies, mayflies, stoneflies, etc. And as you go down the groups, you start to get a little bit more tolerance towards pollution. And if you have a stream that is just completely trashed and just in terrible shape, the only thing that you're going to find are the critters that are in group 3, such as like leeches, aquatic worms, etc. So let's talk about some actual specific aquatic macroinvertebrates. We're going to start with the big 3, which are going to be EPT. 3 major insect orders are most often referenced for biotic indexes. The first are the mayflies, which are Ephemeroptera, so that's where the E comes from. The next is Plecoptera, which are the stoneflies, and that's where the P comes from. And then we have the caddisflies, which are Trichoptera. And again, that's where the T comes from. So these three insect orders are critically important because they can't tolerate streams that have really bad pollution. And if they, again, disappear, we've got problems going on within our stream systems. So now we're just going to go through these three groups and get an idea of what they are and their lifestyles. So starting with the mayflies. So mayflies, we have the adult winged version here. And then we have the immature stage, which is known as a nymph. So the nymph of the mayfly lives underwater, while the adult stage, which is known as an imago, lives in terrestrial ecosystems on land. So mayflies are an ancient order of insects dating back to the Carboniferous period, which is over 300 million years ago. And you can see right here, we have the Carboniferous period all the way before even the dinosaurs started showing up. So quite a long time ago. And before I forget, Tess, are you recording this?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Just making sure. So mayflies spend about a year in that nymph stage of their life, so living underwater. However, when they are adults, they do not have a very long lifespan. Some adults are only going to be alive for a total of 5 minutes. Usually, though, they're going to be, a few hours to maybe a day in length in terms of life expectancy. So they quite literally live fast and die young when it comes to the life of a mayfly. Mayfly adults, so the imago, have a pair of short antennae, which you can see right here. They have no functional mouth parts, so they're not feeding or eating anything. And they have 2 pairs of wings, which you can see right here. And they have 3 tails, so 1, 2, 3, at the end of their abdomen. Just a better look at what their hind wings can potentially look like. They can vary in size, some of which can be completely almost non-existent in appearance. And sexual dimorphism exists in mayflies. So the males are going to have larger eyes, and they are also going to have longer front legs than the females. So the males have larger eyes, so when they are flying around, they're going to be able to see the females as they're flying around. And then when they are mating, they use the long front legs to hold the female while they're mating and flying through the sky. Mayflies are unique from all other extant insect orders, so the opposite of extinct, so still alive, due to a sub-imago form. So mayflies are the only insects to molt when they have wings. So this is a very primitive aspect when it comes to insects. No other insects alive today molt while they still have wings. And the sub-imago form looks a little bit different compared to the adult. So they usually have darker wings. And then for the males, their front legs are going to be a little bit shorter compared to when they're a full-grown imago. Mayfly nymphs have wing pads on their backs. So you can see right in here where their wings will end up developing. And they often have 3 distinct tails. So you can see 1, 2, 3. The 2 that are on the very outermost are known as cerci. And cerci are sensory appendages that are used to basically figure out what's going on in the area. And it's a good way to tell, hey, is there a predator that's behind me? Some of them will also whip them up into the air and face them towards predators as if they were a scorpion. And then they also have gills of varying numbers that are on their abdomen, right here. Some can be like feathery in shape, others just look like big circles. And mayflies have a lot of diversity to their overall body plan. The key thing with these guys, as well as pretty much the rest of the critters that we're going to look at today, form fits function. So animals have certain body shapes for a reason. It's to help them be able to do what they do best. So for example, some mayfly nymphs are clingers. They have a flattened dorsoventral body. So basically they're flattened like a pancake, and they live under rocks in the currents of streams. So see how they have big old chunky legs? These are filled with mussels so that they can grip onto a rock surface when the waters are rushing over their bodies, and they're basically suction cupped to the rocks so that they don't go flying downstream. Some mayfly nymphs are swimmers. They are thin and streamlined, and they can swim pretty fast through the water. These guys in particular are going to be shaped like a little torpedo. They tuck their legs underneath as they're swimming through the water, and they have circular gills that end up reducing drag as they're swimming through the water. Some mayfly nymphs are burrowers. They have tusks right here, and then they'll have shovel-like forelegs that they'll use to help them dig through the sand. So they'll end up constructing little tunnels that are down in the sand within the substrate of the stream. And as they're in their tunnels, they have these big feathery gills, and they'll end up waving them around, and it causes water circulation to go through their little tunnel, and it helps oxygenate them so they can breathe better within their tunnels. Some mayfly nymphs are filterers. They catch organic particles in the water column using the setae on their forelegs. So setae are going to be these hair-like bristles that you can see on the forelegs of this mayfly. And they're going to be holding their arms out into the water. And as algae and other little like bacteria and things are floating through, they'll get caught on those hairs, and they'll bring them in, and they'll basically eat that food that they catch that way. And then some mayfly nymphs are just plain weird. So this particular group, Baticidae, their wing pads are shaped like little armored spikes, and they look like they're a little war machine that you'd see in something like Mad Max. So they've got armor plating up here, and then these sharp spines that protrude out from the side. So they can end up ramming into critters that end up trying to eat them and scaring them away. So here's just the general life cycle of a mayfly. Starting out as an egg, they'll hatch and they'll be really, really small, and they'll live down in the substrate at the bottom of the stream. They'll be digging further in. And once they're big enough, they come up to the surface, and they'll be continuing to grow, feeding on usually algae and periphyton and other things like that, like rotting leaves. And then as they grow big enough, once they're ready to become an adult, they start to climb out towards the water. And usually they climb up to the water's edge and out, and then they molt into a subimago form. So they'll shed that exoskeleton, and they'll be that subimago, and then they'll molt again into the adult form. And the males, again, they have the longer forelegs so they can grasp the female while they're mating. And then the female will lay her eggs in the water and continue the next generation. So now we move on to the stoneflies. So stoneflies are going to be a little bit different looking compared to the mayflies. You can already tell, holding their wings in a different position, not as many tails. So while still a primitive group of insects, stoneflies are more advanced than the mayflies. They do not have that sub-imago form that the mayflies have. Instead, they go straight from a nymph stage into an adult stonefly stage. Stonefly adults generally live for 1 to 2 weeks, you know, a little bit longer than the mayflies, all things considering. And then nymphs can be anywhere from 1 to 4 years old before they become adults. So quite a bit long-lived compared to the mayfly nymphs. And this is an example of an armored stonefly nymph. And these guys can live up to 4 years of age, and they grow very big. Stonefly adults generally have 2 pairs of membranous wings that fold over their back. So you can see right here how their wings are folded over. And they have 2 tails. So like we were saying before, the mayfly, they have the cerci, so sensory appendages that are on the end of their tail. And their wings are very veiny and just pretty distinct in appearance. Adults will communicate to each other using drumming sounds with their abdomens. So they'll end up going up to, say, like a stick or a rock, and they will smack their abdomen on the rock, and they'll create different sounds. So what this looks like when it comes to actually seeing the sound frequency, here we have an example. The male is calling out, and he drums pretty loudly to start, and then he slowly gets softer. And then the female has kind of an opposite response where she starts quietly, and then she grows louder and louder before the male responds back. So interesting sort of communication going on between the stoneflies. Stonefly nymphs are generally going to have chewing mouth parts up at the front. They have 2 tails, so the 2 cerci. And then they have gills that are either on their head, thorax, or abdomen. So you can kind of see them from up top. You can see them sticking out like there. It looks kind of like hairy armpits. Much easier to see when you flip this one over. So you can see the gills that are protruding right here. And sometimes they'll have gills that are just very difficult to see. They won't have gills this obvious. Maybe it'll be like a tiny little thing around their neck. In this case, you can also see this stonefly has butt gills. So gills can be varying all over the place on these critters. So stonefly nymphs are not as diverse in morphology as mayflies and caddisflies, but they still come in many shapes and sizes. So some stonefly nymphs have varying shapes for their wing pads. So for example, we have one here, much smaller wing pads compared to the one that we were just looking at. And they're more straightened and thin and elongate in appearance and run across the back of the body. Some stonefly nymphs look like little cockroaches that are roaming around in the stream. So you can see here completely different looking wing pads compared to the last one that we were just looking at, where they're more thicker and just bulkier in shape and really give this stonefly a sort of cockroach appearance. Others can grow very large and are covered in armor. So this is that armored stonefly that we were looking at before. And these guys can grow as big as your finger. I have caught very large individuals of these critters when out in really nice streams. And they end up, when they're kind of afraid of you or any other predators that are near them, they'll curl up into a little ball to help protect themselves So they'll try and cover up their vulnerable underside and expose their armor basically to the predator that is attacking them. And then for the stonefly life cycle, you can see, pretty similar to the mayfly, just lacking that sub-imago stage. So they've got the eggs that hatch into the nymph. The nymph continues to grow, and eventually it ends up either floating to the surface or climbing up onto a stick or something else protruding from the water. And then the adult emerges from the nymph and flies away to mate and eventually continue the cycle over. So now we have the trichopterans, which are the caddisflies. Now with these ones, when it comes to the immature stage, we refer to them as larvae instead of nymphs. So that is one of the differences between the mayflies, the stoneflies, and then the caddisflies. And continuing on with the theme, caddisflies are more advanced than both mayflies and stoneflies, and they're actually most closely related to moths and butterflies. So when you take a look at a moth in comparison to a caddisfly, you can see it, it's there. Similar way of holding the wing structures. Overall build is relatively similar. And there's other features that are pretty similar as well. So many caddisflies complete one generation within a year. Some will take several years, while others can have multiple generations per year. Usually it depends on how resources are going within the stream, as well as just the general setup of the species. Caddisfly adults are distinct from mayflies and stoneflies in that they have hairs and scales that are covering their wings. So you can see some hairs that are going to be on the wings, as well as scales, so very similar to moths. And some caddisfly adults have very distinct, striking colorations, especially in comparison to other adult aquatic insects. So here we have a really pretty orange, white, and black colored caddisfly. And this one just really stands out as a really beautiful animal. Not just because orange is one of my favorite colors, but just in general, very pretty animal. And you don't really get this when it comes to adult aquatic insects like the mayflies and the stoneflies. So just kind of a weird thing to see when it comes to these aquatic insects. So caddisfly larvae are going to be very caterpillar-like, and they have a head capsule that is sclerotized. So when I say sclerotized, that means it's going to be hardened and thick. So think of it like wearing a football helmet kind of thing. It's going to be extra protection for the head. And they have their thorax right here. Usually they'll have a certain level of plating on their backs. So on these three thoracic segments right here where their legs are. So you can see 1, 2, 3 for this one having plates. And then their abdomen goes all the way down. And one of their other key features is they have butt hooks. That's putting it as blunt as possible. They use these butt hooks to hook onto surfaces such as rocks, so that way they don't go flying downstream from the current. Caddisfly larvae come in varying shapes and sizes, and they have different sclerotization on their thorax. So for this one, this is a chunky little caddisfly. This is a micro caddisfly. You can see very, very chunky abdomen, while the head and the thorax are very small in size. And you can see we've got 3 armored plates on the thorax up here. But then when we look at this caddisfly, so we have 1, 2, 3, we'll see that on the third thoracic segment, we've got really tiny plates instead of these big plates. And even on the second one, we've got a reduction in the plating. So that's going to be one of the ways you can help identify these guys amongst each other. But then sometimes you'll also get, like this one has this really big hump right here. Something like that will help secure the caddisfly within its case. Now, I haven't mentioned the case yet because, to be honest, it is without a doubt the coolest thing about caddisflies. So caddisfly larvae are able to produce silk, and with that, they will make cases and retreats. So they'll take material that they find in the stream around them, and they'll end up piecing it together to create their own little home, basically like a mobile home that they carry around with them to move to different areas. Generally, caddisfly cases consist of materials from the stream benthos, such as sand, pebbles, gravel, leaves, and sticks. So for example, this caddisfly, you can see, has taken sand pebbles and has made a case out of them. Here we have a caddisfly that has made a case out of little gravel and pebbles from the stream bottom. This caddisfly ended up taking a whole bunch of sticks that were on the bottom and basically chopping them up into fine little pieces and creating what looks like a little Jenga fort of a case with that using silk. Here's a cool thing. So we have an example of a caddisfly that has made a case that is virtually identical in shape to a snail shell. So we have an example of convergent evolution. So we have a caddisfly that has evolved basically a protective case, or think of it like a shell, that is similar in appearance to a snail's shell. However, they have completely different ancestral lineages. So just happen to evolve them in a similar manner. So the caddisfly ends up taking pebbles and forming a snail shell, and you can see it protrudes out from the side there like that. Of course, sometimes the caddisflies, why end up making a snail shell using pebbles and stuff when you can just go around and find leftover shells that are going to be on the bottom and just piece them onto your case and just do that instead. So some caddisflies will literally just take whatever they can find and piece it together into a case. Some people take advantage of this and they will make caddisfly jewelry. So you can put a caddisfly in with some really colorful pebbles and rocks, and the caddisfly will basically make a little case that looks like jewelry, and people will sell that for a profit. And then you have an example of a caddisfly that took leaves and basically glued them onto its case to act as camouflage. And then here I'll just show you, won't be able to hear the sound unfortunately, but here's a caddisfly in action underwater.
Where's the caddisfly?
The caddisfly is right here.
Okay.
So you can see its legs.
Yeah, he's small compared to the, oh my gosh.
Yep, so very large case.
Wow. What is that case? What is the case made of?
So that one is going to be like little pieces of wood and debris, etc.
And he's fastened it together.
Mm-hmm. All right. So other caddisflies are free living and spin silk nets to catch their prey and debris. So here's an example of a caddisfly that has, you can quite literally see it looks like a little silk net right here. And you'll have all kinds of debris that has built up. So they spin this silk net and they'll be building this downstream of where water is coming from a fast flow. And they can use that to catch insects and other debris that float downstream and get caught in the net. So if they get some like little sticks and stuff, they can use that to keep building reinforcements. Or if they get an insect, they've got a nice tasty treat that they can feed on. And then here is the overall life cycle of the caddisfly. So you can see, starting from the egg, we have our free living or cased caddisfly. Now, unlike the stoneflies and the mayflies, caddisflies will end up turning into a pupa. So the pupa is going to be an intermediate stage between that larva and the adult. And the pupa will be able to swim up to the surface of the water. And basically, the adult ends up emerging from the pupa and uses that pupa case like a raft. So that way it's able to kind of spread its wings out, get adjusted, and then it takes to the sky and ends up mating and continuing the life cycle further.
Could you go back over the three groups you've talked about and compare the life cycle of each one?
Towards the end, like we can do that at the end.
Okay.
So why should we care about EPT? So EPT taxa are generally very sensitive to water quality changes. If they disappear from the stream, then you've got a problem. So they act like the canary in the coal mine situation, where for those who don't know, coal miners used to take canaries down into the coal mines, and when conditions got too dangerous, like oxygen levels dropping, etc., and dangerous gases building up, if the canary stopped singing, the canary kicked the bucket. And that meant that conditions were starting to get dangerous and it was time to get out. So this is going to give us an idea of how bad things are going within the stream. So if we see that the EPT are disappearing, that's our warning signal that we've got to change something. And you can have streams that were just heavily polluted and just completely trashed that will not have any EPT left over. And just, it's just a bad thing when that happens. It ends up completely damaging the entire ecosystem. You can eventually recover it, but it takes a lot of effort to do so. EPT taxa play an incredibly important role in the transfer of energy across aquatic and terrestrial systems. So here we've got a trout that is feeding from the surface on a mayfly that has landed on the water or is ready to fly away. And what's the thing with this is you have animals that start off in the water, so they can be fed upon by fish, crayfishes, frogs, turtles, etc. But then they end up also transferring over to a terrestrial ecosystem where other animals like birds, spiders, etc. are able to feed on them as well. So they're able to take the energy from like fallen leaves that are in the stream that they're shredding up and eating, algae, etc. And they can help transfer that energy across a variety of different ecosystems. So that's incredibly important for that energy transfer. And then EPT taxa are heavily used in recreational activities such as fly fishing, and they also help maintain stable sports fish populations. So if we want a healthy trout population that we're using for fishing, we want to make sure that we've got healthy aquatic insects that are in the stream with them to support them. And fly fishermen will use what are known as flies. So think of that as your lure. And they are a hook that is basically dressed up to imitate a insect or another prey item. So in this case, this is the green weenie fly. This is one of my favorite flies. This one is a killer for getting sunfish and bass. I've had a lot of luck with this one in smaller streams. And it mimics these big, fat, green caddis flies that just look like a nice plump meal for a predatory fish. So they've got the green body and the weight on the front that looks like the sclerotized front of a caddisfly. And even the terrestrial, the adults, are also going to be mimicked by fly fishermen. So fly fishermen are trying to mimic that adult insect landing on the surface of the water and getting a fish to rise up and strike after that fly. They want to mimic what an actual insect is doing. So this is a way to help connect fishermen more into just that general process of nature and just be more engrossed within it. So some of the best fly fishermen are also entomologists as well. So those who study insects. So let's test your newfound knowledge. So I'm going to put a picture of an aquatic insect on the screen, and there's going to be a question about it. And you're going to type into the chat whether it's A, B, or C, which are, obviously different answers. And Tess is going to keep an eye on the chat and let me know what people end up thinking the answer is. So first one, what is this aquatic insect? So type it into the chat. Is it a mayfly, a stonefly, or a caddisfly? So remember, look at things that we see on the body.
Let's see, we have an answer for stonefly.
Mm-hmm.
So far
Any
we
others?
have an answer. Oops, okay, couple answers for stonefly. Okay, looking like 3 answers so far for stonefly. Okay, everybody said stonefly. Nice.
And they are correct. So the answer is stonefly. And you can see it's got the 2 cerci and just that general body shape. It's got the chewing mouth parts, those wing pads. Pretty standard looking stonefly right there. All right. Ooh, big old chonker. What is this aquatic insect? Type it into the chat. Is it a mayfly, a stonefly, or a caddisfly?
Okay, we're getting some caddisfly answers. Okay, more caddisfly. Yep, looking like solid caddisfly.
Perfect. You are correct. It is indeed a caddisfly. Big old chunky larva. It's got the butt hooks right here, that highly sclerotized head. All right. What is this aquatic insect? Is it a mayfly, a stonefly, or a caddisfly?
Looking like mayfly. People are going for mayfly right away.
They are correct. It is a mayfly. We've got the 3 tails right here. So perfect. Got it. All right. So mayfly's correct. Huh. What is this aquatic insect? Is this one a mayfly, a stonefly, or a caddisfly? So take note of this, but then what's going on in here as well?
Okay, we got some answers for stonefly.
Mm-hmm.
It is a tricky one, yes. Some more answers for stonefly. Looking like people are saying stone. Oh, okay, we got one answer for mayfly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So this one this is a trick question. This is a mayfly. And this is, yeah, I'm sorry. This is, I had to throw this one in there just to show that sometimes there's little exceptions that you get to the rule. And for this one, you know, this is a mayfly that is lacking that third tail in there. However, one of the ways that you can definitely tell that this is still a mayfly, you still have these abdominal gills that are running down the side of the body like that. So that's a tricky one. So I don't feel bad if you got that one wrong.
Some people are asking, why is that one, doesn't it have the middle tail?
You know, that's a really good question. It's honestly, I personally don't know. If I had to guess, the reason being would be the two most important parts on this mayfly are going to be the outermost tails, because those are the sensory parts. That innermost tail isn't necessarily going to be important for that. It's probably going to be more important for balancing. And in this case, this is, when you look at this, see how flattened out it is? It's probably going to be clinging to a stone and not really have to worry as much as balance. But ultimately, that's just a guess. I do not know the answer to that, unfortunately. That's something that I'll have to research into. All right, and then one more. This is a slightly different question. What lifestyle does this insect have? Is this a clinger, a burrower, or a swimmer? So we can tell it's a mayfly, and that's not a trick question. This is a mayfly. But look at what's going on its body.
Okay, we're getting some answers for clinger, some answers for burrower, and some for swimmer. We have the most answers for clinger so far. But also some people are saying burrow or swim.
Okay, so this is another tricky one. This is going to be a burrower. So this is a burrowing mayfly, because you can see the tusks up here that are used for burrowing. Now, I can see perfectly why people might have thought that this is a clinger, because look at them thick legs. Like, those are pretty chunky. So this is a case where this is a burrowing mayfly that isn't quite as like having the scoopies when it comes to the front legs, but the tusks are going to be the thing that you're looking at on this particular mayfly. All good then to continue on?
Yeah, some people were agreeing. They were looking at the legs.
Yep. Yeah, the legs can be really tricky with this one. So this is one that, you know, could potentially do both, but more adapted for the burrowing lifestyle because of the tusks. So good call on looking at the legs, though. That's one thing. I'm glad you're paying attention to that aspect. All right, so we played like a fun little game there, testing the knowledge. So really quick, let's kind of just stretch out a little bit, because, you know, not only for everyone listening is this a long presentation, but, you know, also for me, this is a long presentation. So it doesn't hurt to kind of just stretch your body a little bit, get the blood flowing, you know, take a drink of water, you know, keep the gills hydrated. We don't want to end up being stiff and hard like a freshwater mussel shell. So I'm going to probably pronounce this wrong because I am terrible at pronunciations, but Unionoida are the freshwater mussels. I'm not going to try and pronounce it again because it just gets me every single time. So we're just going to say the mussels from now on. So freshwater mussels are another ancient group. And they invaded freshwater systems as early as the Triassic period. So here we have some fossils of freshwater mussels. And most people tend to think of a freshwater mussel as a living rock, because quite frankly, they look like a living rock. But there's really more to them to that, much more. And you can see that, yes, they do end up moving, not very quickly, but they do end up moving. So first, let's kind of familiarize ourselves with the freshwater mussel. So starting off, we have the umbo, or the beak. So this is where everything comes up and rounds up on the freshwater mussel up here. And you can see this is the inside portion when looking at it, where the umbo would be. Now, mussels have what are called teeth. Don't think of them as teeth like, what we use to chew things with. The teeth of the freshwater mussel are designed to help keep the shell shut nice and tight. So they have lateral teeth that, as the name suggests, they run lateral to the shell right here. And then they have pseudocardinal teeth, which are going to kind of look like either your canine teeth or your molar teeth for the mammals. And when we look at these and we have a shell completely popped open, we get a better idea of what's going on here. So the lateral teeth, when the shell closes, are going to come together perfectly together. So this part will fit in right there. And then the pseudocardinal teeth, so this tooth right here, is going to fit in perfectly right in here. So that is going to help keep that mussel nice, tight, shut, and prevent it from getting smashed open. So whether that be protecting the mussel from a predator such as a muskrat, or just from stones and rocks that are moving around within the stream, this helps keep the mussel cell shut. And then you can also see the scars inside of the mussel shell as well. And even here, you can see where the actual body of the mussel was before. So that's where the foot and the internal organs would be. So here we have an example of freshwater mussels being very confusing, frustrating creatures. So freshwater mussels in general have a gigantic amount of diversity to their shells. But another curious thing that happens with them is we've got another case of form fits function, but we have it on a slightly different scale. So you can have a freshwater mussel species that has two different general appearances depending on the habitat that it's living in. This caused a lot of problems for scientists back in the day trying to identify them, because they would think, oh, this is a different species. Look how different looking it is. Not the case. So, for example, we have Fuscinaia flava. And this mussel, you can see in the small streams, it has a shape that is more elongated and flattened. And it kind of looks like the head of a shovel. And the reason for that is when you're in a smaller stream, you want to make sure that you're flattened out, because the water levels are not going to be very high, and they're more likely to dry out compared to a larger stream. So you want to make sure that you're kind of tucked down under the water well enough. And if you have to burrow down into the stream, it's better to be shaped like a shovel so you can make your way down into the stream bottom easier. Now, in a larger stream, this species looks completely different. It looks big and bulky and inflated. And it takes the appearance of an anchor. And the reason for this is that when you're in a big, large stream, you have stronger currents that are going to be running up against your body, and you're going to have large rocks that could potentially shift around and hit you. So you want to be big, bulky, and protecting yourself and anchoring yourself down to the bottom. So very fascinating aspect of mussels in that regard, but it gets better. So when we look at a freshwater mussel that lives within a pond or a lake where you don't have that water current that's rushing against them or anything like that, or if they're living in like a nice, calm, sandy stream, they are going to have very thin, almost paper-like shells. So you can see generally kind of looks a little frail in appearance, like it might be brittle. And then when we look at the teeth up here, you basically can't see any teeth here. So this mussel shell doesn't need to have those strong teeth to keep the shell shut, because it doesn't have to worry about like rocks and water smacking against the shell. So that's why it's able to be a little bit more frail in comparison to a stream-dwelling species that's going to be living where there's going to be a lot of rocks. So these guys are going to have a little bit of a thicker, harder shell. And then you can see they've got the pseudocardinal teeth and the lateral teeth that are well developed. In comparison over here, you know, looking back and forth at them, the difference, you can see it right there immediately. So just an example of how form fits function and why certain animals have certain features to them. And freshwater mussels, in order to move around, they use their large muscular foot to basically propel themselves very, very, very slowly. And they will also use it to anchor themselves into the bottom of the substrate. So they'll dig their their muscular foot down into the substrate, and they'll use that as an anchor. It'll be covered with mucus to help protect it from rocks and other sharp objects. And then they'll stick their feeding apparatus up so that they can feed easily. So here's a video of a mussel extending its foot. And you'll get an idea of just how slow these things will be when it comes to moving. Sorry, I'm not able to provide any sounds, but it would just be the sounds of water rushing up against the camera. So, but yeah, just in general, they take forever to move around. So that's the big key aspect of this video, just showing how much of a hassle it is just to move like a few inches for this animal. So this is like, we're getting towards a minute and 30 seconds. So, and it just like barely shifted its body. So important to keep that in mind for the future. So freshwater mussels are going to be filter feeding through siphons. So they have an in-current siphon that they will face towards flowing water. So water is flowing towards their direction. and they will catch algae, bacteria, and other organic materials through this in-current siphon and feed on that. And then through the X-current siphon up top, they will end up expelling waste. And if there's anything like sand or other debris that gets caught in the in-current siphon, the mussel will wrap it up in mucus and it will release it through the X-current siphon. So think in-current, things go in, X-current, things exit. And here's an example of one filter feeding. So water's flowing in this direction. You can see the water moving, that algal buildup going through the in-current siphon. Down here, you can see there's a little caddisfly friend roaming next to our mussel. And then the X-current siphon where it's expelling out waste product. It sounds silly, but it's surprisingly peaceful when you're just down in a stream, just sitting there watching mussels filter feed and just listening to the sounds of nature around you. It's a great way to just escape the chaos of life and just be peaceful and at one with nature. So freshwater mussels are capable of filtering up to 15 gallons of water per day. So here we have an example of 2 fish tanks that were filtered over 24 hours. This one has no freshwater mussels in it. This one, we see about 3 freshwater mussels in there. And look how clear that water is in comparison to the tank on the left. Like, it is absolutely insane how powerful these critters are at cleaning up freshwater ecosystems. And imagine having mile-long stretches of these critters filter feeding and cleaning everything up. It's just going to be wonderful and having a nice, healthy stream system. Now, freshwater mussels have a lot of diversity, especially down towards the south, and they've kind of spread quite a bit throughout North America. So the question is, how does a freshwater mussel move to different streams? Because remember, we saw how slow they were. Like, how exactly can a freshwater mussel go upstream? Like, that seems pretty difficult. And yeah, you know, we've had several hundreds of thousands of years for them to be able to do this, but that's a long time for what is basically a living rock, right? So how are freshwater mussels going to get past this? Just wait. Here comes the really crazy part about freshwater mussels. So freshwater mussels start life as parasitic larvae called Glaucidium. Now, when you look at these little guys, they kind of look like little butterflies of sorts, like, you know, kind of like fluttering around like that. And this one in particular, it kind of looks like Pac-Man. But when you really get a good look at them, you realize, oh my God, these things are kind of terrifying looking. So the Glaucidium are like little vampires that end up feeding on the blood of usually fish. And they look like little chain chomps that you would see from Mario. And what ends up happening is these Glaucidium will attach to a fish host, feed on them, and eventually turn into an adult mussel after falling off of them. Now, how can we get these guys onto a fish host. Remember, it's a freshwater mussel. It's a living rock, right? How are you going to attract a fish to get your babies on it? So some freshwater mussels use what are called conglutinates to attract fish hosts. So they'll create these little egg sacs that are filled with glaucidia that look like other critters. So for example, we have something that looks kind of like a small fish or a little macroinvertebrate. There's another one, we've got the little tails that kind of looks like some of the insects we saw before. Others, well, quite literally, it looks like a little fish that's swimming through the water, and you can see very faintly a mucus thread that is coming off of this female mussel that she's using as a lure. So fish, like these little darters, are going to see these and think, wow, that's a delicious looking snack. I better eat this. And they end up biting it, and it explodes open, and it releases those little baby glaucidia, and the fish will suck them up, and they will attach onto the gills or the fins of fish that attack these conglutinates. Other freshwater mussels are going to use lures that explode when they're bitten, and that releases the glaucidia on the fish. So here we can see up top here, we have mussels that have lures that look like little fish. And then you've got one down here that looks like a little crayfish. And then one that looks like a worm. Now, bear in mind, this animal doesn't have eyes. How did something like this evolve such a lure to be able to attract fish like that? So in action, they are able to wave this around like it's a little fish. So you can see we've got some fish hanging out on the bottom, and we have our freshwater mussel mama over here. And you can see her lure that she's waving around. It kind of looks like those fish that are scuttling around on the bottom. So a big old bass that sees that is going to think that's an easy meal, bite down, and then all the glaucidia are going to be released and attach onto the fish. So here's an example of just the movement that they can do with the lure. And you can see that gray part in there. That's basically the mine. So once the mine is triggered, boom, that's when the glaucidia are going to explode out and attach to the fish host. So here we can see on the gill of a fish, we have the little baby glaucidia that are feeding like little vampires attached to the fish. And then same thing happening on the fin of this particular fish. Now, this is kind of insane when you think about it. How does an animal evolve to be able to pull something off like this? Because this is such a great way to overcome being what is essentially a living rock. Fish are going to be swimming all over the place. They're able to travel to new stream systems that open up through new pathways when you have a stream capture event. So when you have one stream flood over into a new stream drainage, and the fish can end up crossing right over, and it will bring any mussels that it has attached to its gills over with it. And once they grow big enough, they simply fall off the fish and grow into adult mussels and filter feed for the rest of their lives. It is just such a fascinating aspect to these animals, and it just blows my mind. Like, they are my second favorite animals out there. They're just so cool. Just mind-blowing when you think about it. All right, so why should we care about freshwater mussels? Much like EPT, freshwater mussels are very sensitive to poor water quality, especially sedimentation issues. So when it comes to the water quality, remember, they're filter feeding. So if you have pollution, it's going to go straight into the freshwater mussel and it's going to kill it. Like, they're not going to be able to survive dealing with that. And sedimentation is going to be when you have excess soil, sand, gravel, etc., that is entering into stream systems through things like stormwater runoff. And this is going to clog up all of the different rocks that are going to be in the stream. So all that habitat where animals could be hiding, you can't find any place to live in there anymore. For the freshwater mussel, they take in too much of that sediment and it's just too overwhelming for them. They can't create enough mucus to be able to keep up, and it shreds up the insides of the mussel and they end up dying like a slow, like suffocating death from it, unfortunately. Freshwater mussels help keep our streams clean through filter feeding. So we can spend millions upon millions of dollars on these fancy filtration systems and everything like that, but we have natural filtration systems that are already in place within freshwater ecosystems. And at this point, it's best to use a combination of both. So that way you can handle the really heavy duty stuff and save a bunch of money when you've got freshwater mussels helping to take care of the things that are just a little bit too much for the natural environment to handle. And freshwater mussels are a food source for several animals. So things like muskrats will be feeding on them. And when they leave their leftover shells, this creates habitat for other animals. And even when they're deceased or when they're living, other critters are going to be living on their shells. So here's an example of a freshwater mussel shell that is deceased. And you've got a crayfish that has taken up residence within that shell. And you've got a snail that's also called this shell as home. So just very important animals to the freshwater ecosystem. It's really fascinating. A lot of people aren't very familiar with them. So you probably learned a lot about freshwater mussels there. But now it is time. The time has come, my friends, for the crayfish. For the best part, my favorite animals. Let's go. Get excited. I love crayfish. Let's talk about these wonderful animals. So Canberridae are going to be the North American crayfishes that are found east of the Rocky Mountains. Now, in my humble opinion, crayfish are the charismatic megafauna of freshwater ecosystems. Now, a lot of people out there really like pandas. For me, no, let's step away from the panda and give me crayfish. Crayfish are just such wonderful animals when it comes to education. Crayfish are big, they're very easy to handle for kids, they're very easy to see, they're really fun to go out in the stream to flip rocks, catch them. It encourages teamwork to go and catch them when you're looking for the biggest rock, because of course the biggest crayfish live under the biggest rock. That's a very important rule. Take that as one of the most important things to learn from this presentation. And overall, they are just wonderful animals. They have so much great personality to them, and some of them come in just such fascinating colors, like this Carax pulcher. This is a species that's from Indonesia that was recently described in 2015. So it is believed that crayfish diverged from their marine ancestors around the mid-Permian to mid-Triassic. And we have some fossil evidence of them here, as well as burrow evidence from when they were constructing tunnels back in those like Jurassic and Triassic Cretaceous periods. Now, we have an interesting thing that we have to think about when it comes to crayfish and with the freshwater mussels as well. So when the crayfish ends up moving from saltwater to a freshwater ecosystem, its ancestor has a problem. The ancestors of crayfish and freshwater mussels as well had planktonic larval stages. So their babies, when they hatched from their eggs, they would be free floating within the ocean waters and just moving about, doing their thing until they eventually grow into adults. Now, stroke beard moment for a second. Think we have a problem. If I want to move upstream and if I have planktonic babies, what's going to happen to those babies if they just get released into the water column and water is flowing downstream? They're going to get sent right back out into the ocean, and they're going to have to make their way back up the stream again. So that's a problem. So crayfish, in order to overcome this, have babies that basically when they hatch, they look like little miniature versions of the adults. And female crayfish are very great parents. They will carry the little babies underneath of their tail. They'll take care of them until they're large enough so that the little babies can then detach from their mother, and then they can just roam around on the bottom of the stream, and they're able to do their crayfish thing. This is how you have something like a crayfish come from a saltwater environment and move to a freshwater environment and be able to evolve into that form. So just a cool little fact about the evolution of crayfish there. Now, crayfish follow the same general body plan, but they have alterations based on their lifestyle or habitat preferences. So here's a classic stream-dwelling species of crayfish. We're going to look at 4 particular things on the crayfish to get an idea of what we're looking at with the different changes, like what adaptations are happening. So the first thing we're looking at are the chelae or the pincers. The next thing we're going to look at is the rostrum. Then we have the areola, or the areola, as the crayfish biologists like to say, because they think areola is a dirty word. And then the cervical spine. So when it comes to a stream-dwelling species of crayfish, the classic thing that most people think about, they are going to have spines on their bodies. So along this rostrum, you can see they've got these pointed ends here. They have spines on their bodies to help protect them from fish predators, because that's what's going to be living within those stream systems. Then they have an open areola. So typically when you have a more open areola in a crayfish, it means that the crayfish is living in an area that has more oxygen in the water. So it's a case of how the carapace adapts for surface area for the gills. And then the chelae, the shape of them will change depending on what this animal does for a living. So some crayfish are going to be large and bulky in shape. And this particular example, Cambarus hazardi, you can see it's kind of flattened out a little bit dorsoventrally. So kind of like we were looking at those mayflies earlier. So these guys prefer living under big, large slab boulders. So really big, flat rocks that are in the stream that they can waddle underneath of, and they have these big, beefy claws that they use to help kind of buoy their way into the best habitat. You can see stream-dwelling species, they've got quite a bit of spination. So spination being spines on the body happening up here. Not quite as much throughout the rest of the body, but it's still there. Some crayfish are going to have large gaps in their chelae that help them cling to the substrate in faster waters. So here we have Cambarus diapalma, and look how weird this thing looks compared to the last crayfish. So we have these really big, bulky claws, and then this sort of gap in here. So this is called a hydrofoil. And what happens is this crayfish is going to be living in fast currents. Water is going to be racing against its body, and the water rushes through these holes, and it helps pin the crayfish down to the bottom of the stream and helps it stay in place. And when you look at the rest of the body of this crayfish, you see, look how smooth the rest of the crayfish is. There's virtually no spines on this animal. So the less spines, the less drag from water that's going to be occurring in these faster areas. So this is a very streamlined crayfish that moves through these faster waters very easily. Crayfish with thin, streamlined bodies, as well as chelae, are going to be adapted for moving through aquatic vegetation. So if you have ever eaten crayfish before, type it in the chat. Just say, yes, I've eaten crayfish. I personally love crayfish. They're delicious. The most common crayfish that you would likely have eaten is the red swamp crayfish that you see on screen here. This is actually an introduced and invasive species in Massachusetts that you might find in wetlands throughout the state. And these guys, you can see they have a very thin body, especially compared to what we were looking at before. And even though their claws are pretty big, the chelae are still relatively thin in shape. And they're using that to maneuver through the thick vegetation that they'll be living in a wetland stream. So several crayfish are also adapted for digging complex tunnels. They have what's known as a vaulted carapace, smaller tails, and shovel-like chelae. So a vaulted carapace means that the carapace is going to be taller in shape and thinner overall. So you can see the areola here is completely closed. We saw earlier the crayfish that had more space there. They are going to be living in places with more oxygen. This animal is living in environments where the oxygen levels are very low. So they'll live in a roadside ditch. They'll live in wetlands, ephemeral pool systems, and they will dig down into the substrate, and they create very complex tunnel systems. So they're not actually living in water like a stream or a lake. So they don't need to have a tail that they use that's big and powerful for swimming because they're walking on land. It's going to be harder to move through their tunnels if they have a bigger tail. They also don't have as much spines because if they had more spines, they're going to get caught in their burrows a little bit easier. So they want to make sure that they're smooth, able to move around easier. And then their chelae are going to be shaped like little shovels, or as my one lab mate likes to describe, scoopies. So they're able to scoop up clay and pile it out in front of the burrows that they're making. And here you can see the example of the vaulted carapace compared to a species that you'll typically find in a stream. So a little bit more barrel shaped for the stream species, but these guys are going to be taller and thinner in shape. So that front view, you really get an idea of that. And then you can kind of see a little bit with this one. The tail is also slightly smaller in shape compared to this other one. And then some crayfish just have absolutely gorgeous colorations, but we're really not entirely sure why that's the case. So this is Canberra spetzneri. This is a recently described burrowing species of crayfish, and it is naturally blue like this. So the lobsters like to claim, you know, oh, we get blue color morphs every now and then. Well, the crayfish, we have cool colors like this just naturally occurring all the time with crayfish. So, you know, that's a case for the crayfish one, in my opinion, for that. But we're still not sure why. It could be a case that these like blue colorations make it harder for animals to see them under certain light conditions, so it could act as camouflage. And it could also be used to help signal other crayfish of their kind for mating purposes. So why should we care about crayfishes? Crayfishes are considered keystone species. So if you end up removing them from the ecosystem, you're going to cause some serious impacts. So think like the keystone in an arch. So if you remove this keystone, the whole system is just going to come crashing down on you. So let's look exactly why that's going to be the case. So crayfish are going to dig out burrows under rocks in streams. So here we can see we have spiny cheek crayfish, which are native crayfish to Massachusetts. They have dug out some holes underneath of rocks where they are living. And then other species end up building these little mud chimneys. So deep down in here, you have a very complex tunnel system where the crayfish is able to dig all the way down to groundwater, and that's how they're able to keep their gills wet. So they'll get their gills wet, and then they're able to dig around where they don't need to be submerged the whole time. And they have these different openings over here that they will plug with mud, or they'll open them back up, or they'll make these little chimneys so that they can help control the humidity and temperature within the burrow system. So they're basically an ecosystem engineer. So think of them like little construction units. And other animals are going to be using these burrows for shelter, and that can be really life-saving. You know, you have fish that are going to be hiding under the rocks in the streams that crayfish are excavating under. So that's shelter for them. You have amphibians, insects, like mice, like rodents, etc. Reptiles are going to all be using crayfish burrows as places to hide and avoid you know, harsh drought conditions, for example. The frog in this picture is a crawfish frog. It is specifically adapted to live only in crayfish burrows. So you have also out in Pennsylvania, in Western Pennsylvania, there's the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake that hibernates / brumates in crayfish burrows for the winter. So if you get rid of the crayfish and you don't have those burrows, you're also going to miss out on these other animals that are using them for shelter. And then crayfish are also just little garbage disposals. They eat pretty much anything they can get their chelae on. So they'll eat aquatic insects, they'll eat fallen leaves, they'll eat algae, paraphyte, and plants. You name it, fish, each other. Crayfish are definitely cannibalistic. They will eat it, and they will help recycle nutrients in the system. And they have incredible impacts on the ecosystem because of that. So here we can see even like rotting carcasses of a fish, they'll end up helping to break that down and recycle energy into animal protein for other animals to eat. And of course, everyone loves to eat crayfish. Many animals eat crayfish, including mink, fish, birds such as great blue herons, and of course, even crayfish biologists like humans and such. You know, we love to eat crayfish as well. So then I just have like one more little game and then the conclusions, and then we'll get on to the questions and everything. So let's test your newfound knowledge. We got 5 more questions, same setup as before. So we have a picture. What kind of mussel would live here? We have 2 choices. Is this mussel going to have a thin shell and reduced teeth? Or is it going to have a thick shell and large teeth? So you can see we've got a river system, got quite a bit of rapids going on, and there's some big rocks that are in there. So is this mussel going to have a thin shell with reduced teeth or a thick shell with large teeth?
Okay, people are saying the thick shell. They're saying B.
They are correct. So that nice thick shell is going to help protect the mussel from those fast water currents as well as falling rocks, and the large teeth help keep the shell shut in those conditions. All right, next question. What are baby mussels called? Are they A, subimagos, B, glaucidia, or C, conglutinates? Type it into the chat.
See, we have some people are saying C. Some people are saying B. Okay, more B's. Looking like the majority is going with B.
Okay, so B is the correct answer, but if you put C, you are on your way with it. Because remember, the conglutinates were going to be what contained the baby mussels. So they were the little things that looked like an insect or like a small fish that mussels used to help lure in fish hosts. And then the subimagos were the mayflies. All right. Where does this crayfish live? Does it live within a stream with really fast currents? Does it live in aquatic vegetation? Or does it dig really deep burrows into the ground?
Let's see some answers. Okay, a mix here. We have some people saying C, some people saying B, and some people saying A. I think we have the
Ooh.
most C's, but it is a mix for sure.
Ooh, I've got some ones that are stumping people. All right, so this one is going to be B. So it's vegetation, and that's because we have a streamlined body as well as the streamlined chelae. Now, if you put C, I can understand because it looks like you've got a vaulted carapace going on here. And you've kind of got that, but the big thing to look for, you can see those really thin chelae that they won't be the best for moving around mud and such. So better for moving through vegetation. All right. Where does this crayfish live? Does this one live in the fast currents of streams and rivers? Does this one live in vegetation? Or does this one live in deep burrows? So remember, look at the certain parts on the crayfish and see, what do you think?
See, we have some answers for A in the fast currents. Okay, more answers for A.
So it looks like A is going to be.
Yeah, looks like majority A.
And they would be correct.
Nice.
So this is a Cambarus gerardianus, and you can see it's got the hydrofoils in the chellae there. And it has some spines on it, but not a huge amount as you go throughout the rest of the body. All right. Where does this crayfish live? Fast currents, vegetation, or deep burrows? So look how big those chellae are, and then that carapace shape.
Okay, answers for C so far. Burrows, yep, looking like people are going with burrowing for the most part.
Yep, so this is a burrower. This is a Lucuni Cambarus dalei. And fun fact, I was able to help find this particular individual when the crayfish biologist was describing this species. So I don't remember if this is one that I specifically dug up, but cool little fact about it. All right, so some quick conclusions. So freshwater invertebrates are incredible organisms with just massive diversity driven by adaptations to their environments. And they play an incredibly important role in the transfer of energy throughout both aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. And each group plays an important role in North America's freshwater ecosystems, whether it's breaking down leaves, filtering water, or creating habitat for other animals. So it's important that we conserve these animals for future generations so that we can all enjoy healthier, better freshwater ecosystems. And then I just have some useful resources. I can put these in the chat after I'm done sharing my screen. A lot of the pictures that I got came from macroinvertebrates.org. This has an amazing key that you can use to help identify different insects that you find in the water. We have the Stroud Water Research Center. This is a research center that's down in my area of southeastern Pennsylvania, and just amazing. They have such fantastic resources, whether it be keys, they have different phone apps that you can use for looking at critters in the stream, and they even have a certification test for identifying macroinvertebrates. Then we have the Atlas of Crayfishes of Connecticut. So this will help you identify most of the crayfishes that you can find in Massachusetts. There are some problems that I feel like are in this overall atlas, but in general, this will get the job done for what you want to do if you go out and catch crayfish in the stream. And then modelmywatershed.org. This is just a fantastic website for looking at greater details about your local watershed. So you can open this up, take a look at the watershed that you're in close detail, and look at what's the land cover, like how much agriculture is in the area, etc. And then just some miscellaneous information, a lot of these pictures came from the internet. They're not my own pictures. And I give credit to all of those who created them. And then I have my contact information here. So I am completely open to having any pictures of like insects, freshwater mussels, crayfish, etc. sent to me. Any questions that you might have, happy to answer them and just overall help spread the love of these wonderful animals. So